This is a continuation of our review of Gray's book entitled Paul, the Apostle and His Critics Through the Centuries, published in 2016. It's a book that claims to be documenting all the significant anti-Paul positions by scholars or by movements or whatever in the past. And this is episode 7, and it's going to focus on Soren Kierkegaard. And this is the title of our episode. Gray, in error, dismissed Kierkegaard as not truly anti-Paul. So we're going to show you what he says, Gray, versus what Soren Kierkegaard says. And my assumption here is that he realizes Soren Kierkegaard is a very respected figure, and when he thinks things through, he's thought them through deeply. So to give him credit as being an anti-Paulinist when he's clearly not a person of hate is a hard pill to swallow. So it seems for Mr. Gray, because he's deflected everything so far as people who only hate Paul. But this, when he gets to Soren Kierkegaard, he can't claim he hates Paul. And so he dismisses him as really being anti-Paul. In other words, maybe he's even defining anti-Paulinism by people who hate Paul instead of people who criticize Paul's validity to be in the Bible at all. All right, so let's take a look. This is episode 7 in our series. This is our readings from the JesusWordsOnly.org website, and let's begin. First, I want to introduce the book itself that we're reviewing. It's called or entitled Paul as a Problem in History and Culture, the Apostle and His Critics Through the Centuries. You can buy, it's by Patrick Gray. You can buy a Kindle edition for $18.14. You can buy a Google Play edition for $17.82. This is a book review I wrote in 2017. This is a book from the Christian publishing house Baker Publishing that anyone who makes a serious study of Paul should acquire. It purports to be a comprehensive historical review of those critical of Paul throughout the centuries, a review of, quote, those who regard him as a problem, Kindle 252 and 285. It has found endorsements as a, quote, versatile volume and of, quote, to be used in the, quote, classroom or for personal reading. That's at the Exploring Church History website. Quote, it is a handy resource for scholars or anyone else who wishes to track down original sources that reflect anti-Paulinism. Lutheran Quarterly, Volume 30, Number 4, 2016. The author, an associate professor of religious studies at Rhodes College, appears to aid Paul's defense, but he never is too out in the open about doing so. Hence, on the surface, it is mostly an objective presentation. Thus, for what it does discuss, it is typically a useful overview. However, Gray never acknowledges there is a legitimate Bible-based reason to reject the writings of Paul. He instead implies most of the time that only those who, quote, despise Paul reject Paul or his writings. The criticism of Paul is largely attributed by Gray to a nonstop stream of hateful slander, not recognizing anyone ever having criticized Paul to seriously defend Yahweh, God, or Jesus, with the sole exception of Kierkegaard. In other words, he gives Kierkegaard a pass that I don't think he's anti-Paul or he's not hating Paul. But in fact, what he's going to do, he'll downplay Kierkegaard saying anything that's actually anti-Paul or critical of Paul, which is, you'll see, is not the case when we go through it in this episode. And finally, shockingly, Gray omits entirely any serious mention of the early Orthodox Christian critic of Paul's authority from 207 AD, Tertullian, a grand omission. And so that is a basically fundamental problem I have, is if you can't catch this one of all the ones where Tertullian says that Paul has no authority as an apostle because he's not mentioned by Jesus or anybody else as being an apostle of Jesus Christ. Oh, it's only Paul's word. I mean, how can you ignore that? And Tertullian was a giant of the early church, pre-Roman Catholicism of the 300s. So anyway, now let's begin on the passages from Kierkegaard that he discusses, and then my review of Kierkegaard's actual positions to compare that to what Gray says are Kierkegaard's views. All right, so let's begin. The title of this section is Only One Non-Hater Christian is Anti-Paul, but supposedly not really, Kierkegaard. Having ignored or hastily dismissed any canonical source as truly anti-Paul, Gray next moves on to what is supposedly the only legitimate Christian who ever seriously criticized Paul who was not a hater in Gray's research, Kierkegaard. But then Gray portrays Kierkegaard as someone whose criticisms of Paul's influence are weighed by his supposedly positive statements about Paul. He says this at Kindle location 2169. Here, by the way, is a picture of Soren Kierkegaard. And if you don't know, this is a sketch of his family made of him in 1840. And he grew up in the Netherlands, near Copenhagen. Hence, Gray implies we need not explore too deeply what Kierkegaard's concerns were all about, what Paul's doctrines did to Jesus' gospel. The way Gray leaves the lone figure of Kierkegaard, whom Gray acknowledges was anti-Paul from purely spiritual motives, and not from any hatred, is such that we have a complete gap of understanding what fuss was raised by Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard was scathing against Paulinism if you pay attention. Gray even quotes Kierkegaard saying Protestantism, quote, is completely untenable because it is a quote, a revelation brought about proclaiming the apostle Paul at the expense of the master Christ. Wow, that's a pretty big negative. Kindle location 172. At the same time, Gray does not cite nor quote any of the supposedly positive statements by Kierkegaard about Paul or Paul's influence that outweigh such negatives he expressed about Paul or Paulinism. Thus, we are left to simply accept Gray's hand wave that makes all Kierkegaard's negative comments go away. These positive remarks must be amazing if they do away with Kierkegaard's most radical rejection of Pauline Christianity as not truly Christian at all. In fact, what he says in his books, it says, I'm not going to call myself a Christian anymore because it's all Pauline. And so, wow, he won't even call himself a Christian because it's become changed completely away from Christ. So he's a real Christian. He's a true Christian, but he's saying all the Christianity of today is a false Christianity. So if you draw out a little bit more of the conclusions, it's unmistakable. He's saying Pauline Christianity is a false version of Christ's message. For a thorough collection of Kierkegaard's critique of Paul and Paulinism, see our article Kierkegaard on Paul, and that's an active URL. Go to this article about the book review of Gray, and you will be able to see these links. Now I'm going to digress so you hear the actual words of Kierkegaard that I believe Gray must have. If he's going to claim this is the one person he agrees sounds on the surface anti-Pauline, and he doesn't tell you what the verses are, doesn't give you what he's thinking, that's really it's not a book review. It's just simply propaganda. So this is what you have to tell us. What was his view and why? So let's listen to what he says. And I'm just going to use quotes. I'm not going to try to interpret. Here we go. Protestantism is Paulinism. This is the headline. Is Paulinism. Protestantism is Paulinism in mitigation, in the negation of true Christianity. A Lutheran trained theologian seeks reform. This is about Kierkegaard. Protestantism, this is from Kierkegaard's Papers and Journals, 1996 at 629. You can see it at books.google. Books.google. That's a link that's active. You can read this very words. Protestantism is altogether untenable. Is that a positive? Is that something you can just brush away as he's not really that anti-Paul? No, he's saying Protestantism is untenable. It is a revolution brought on by proclaiming the Apostle Paul at the expense of the Master Christ. He's saying exactly what Dietrich Bonhoeffer would say later. We now have a Christianity without Christ. The message of Christ is just ignored, and it's all about Paul. If there is to be any question of retaining Protestantism, we confess that this teaching is a mitigation of Christianity, which we humans have allowed ourselves, appealing to God to put up with it. So, what is he saying? He's saying if we want to keep Protestantism, we have to admit that it's a mitigation, a negation of Christianity, which we have allowed ourselves. We've given ourselves permission to negate the message and teachings of Jesus Christ. And we're appealing to God, please put up with it because we created this Bible and we put Paul in the Bible. That's what he's saying. Okay. And instead, Protestantism is blazoned forth as an advance in Christianity. So he's shocked that anybody would say this is an advance. No, it is perhaps the most profound concession to the numerical. You want to get numbers in the pews, make a message that's easy. The road is broad, the way is easy. Instead of Jesus said the correct way, the broad way and the easy way leads to destruction, Jesus says in Matthew 6. But the narrow way and the hard way, that leads to life, and that few there are that find it. So Paul and Jesus are at complete odds. But if you want the numerical, go with Paul. That's what he's saying. This numerality that wants to be Christian, but wants rid of ideality or to have it downgraded. Has the ideals, the values that you need to have in your heart to be saved. That's what he's telling you. And insists upon being such and such a number. That's quote number one. Did he get that? No, he had none of this. This is only something I dug up. How could Gray miss this stuff? Let's continue. And what I quoted you above is all he said. That's it. He said nothing else. He didn't give you a quote, didn't give you a reference, didn't even give you a link to anything. It is of great importance, next quote, especially in Protestantism, to correct the enormous confusion Luther caused by inverting the relation and actually criticizing Christ by means of Paul, the master by means of a follower. Kierkegaard, My Task, in the Essential Kierkegaard, Edward Hand, Princeton University Press, 2004, 46 footnote. You can find this quote also at Kierkegaard's Attack Upon Christendom, 1845-1855. By the way, he unfortunately Kierkegaard, fell into the hands of a Paulinist. So he calls it an attack upon Christendom. He doesn't ever say that. He doesn't directly come out saying, I'm attacking Christendom. He's attacking Pauline Christian people. They're claiming they're Christian, but they're not. They're denigrating the message of Jesus Christ. They've robbed it of its strength. They've mitigated Christianity down to Paulinism. And that's what he's offended by. Anyway, so this is at page 283. Again, a hyperlink if you want to read the original book. Next quote. This is from his journals. As early as the Apostle Paul, the scaling down process begins, and it seems as if the natural man gets off a little easier in becoming a Christian. Nowadays, whole countries and kingdoms are called Christian, and millions of natural men are disguised as Christians. Kierkegaard's journals. Yeah, when you make it all about belief, everybody can be a Christian. I believe in Jesus. I believe in the Nicene Creed. Just say it. I've said it 100 times when I was in Catholic Church. I said it even more when I was 40 years a Protestant. In Protestant churches, mainline churches. But it doesn't make it true. It doesn't make it that you're really a Christian just by saying things and by believing things. That's what he's offended by. And it's not does not have the ideality, the message of Jesus Christ. This is quoting David McCracken, The Scandal of the Gospels, Jesus' Story and Offense, 1994 at 65. Next quote. Only the God-man, Jesus, would be able to endure the propagation of the doctrine by proclaiming it, even if he did not gain one single follower. Pause. What he's saying there is Jesus was willing to give a message that nobody would accept. Okay? He didn't care about numbers. He wasn't trying to win a huge number. He even said few will ever find his message is true. Few. That's his message, that it's a narrow gate that you have to enter. Broad is the way and easy is the way that leads to destruction, and narrow and difficult is the way to enter into life. And it's a narrow way. So he didn't expect many people to follow him. And yet you're supposed to believe Christianity is this huge religion, and that's automatically reflective of Christ because it's now been victorious. That's what you're told. The very victory of the Protestant Reformation is itself its own validation, rather than where is the narrow way? Have you taken the broad way of Paul or the narrow way of Jesus? The answer is obvious. Let's continue. The Apostle Paul still has some selfish urge for alleviation. Acquiring adherents become many, something the God man does not have to do. He does not selfishly crave adherents and therefore has only market price of eternity, not the market price of the world, which is cheap when you read the whole context. Kierkegaard, What Do I Want? 1855 in the Essential Kierkegaard, Princeton University, 2004, 33. Next heading. Paul made Christianity the religion of Paul and not of Christ. This is the quote from journals. In the teaching of Christ, religion is completely present tense. Jesus is the prototype, and our task is to imitate him. Become a disciple. By the way, read John chapter 8, 29 through 37. Jesus says you have to become my disciple to be born again, to be a son in the kingdom. Otherwise, you'll be continuing to be a slave of sin. He's telling these men who believe in him. So believe alone is right there. And Jesus says, not adequate. You have to become my disciple, or you're going to remain a slave of sin. You will not be born a son in the house and live forever. So read that, and you'll get a real wake up call that, oops, you overlooked something in Jesus' words that which crush the faithful doctrine. But I digress. But then through Paul came a basic alteration. Paul draws attention away from imitating Christ and fixes attention on the death of Christ, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. The atoner. What Martin Luther in his Reformation failed to realize is that even before Catholicism, Christianity had become degenerate at the hands of Paul. Paul made Christianity the religion of Paul, not of Christ. Paul threw the Christianity of Christ away, completely turning it upside down, making it just the opposite of the original proclamation of Christ. Yeah, so that's what he's doing. He's saying, hey, I'm just comparing what Paul says against Jesus, and Paul is an apostate when you measure it by Jesus, the prophet of Deuteronomy 18, which I want to insist you, if you ever are on the fence, go read Acts 3, verse 23 to 24, where Peter tells you Jesus is the prophet of Deuteronomy 18, and anyone who does not obey the prophet would be cut off from God's people. That means you can't disobey him. That means you can't contradict him and give a different message like Paul does, and therefore give a different direction that Jesus is giving of how to be saved. Jesus is completely clear of a different gospel that turns on works-worthy repentance. You can't even use atonement, Jesus says, until you do your works-worthy repentance and seek forgiveness from the person you've offended. And he says you have to put your atonement gift, your blood sacrifice offer, whatever it was, the doron you were using to atone for your sin, you had to put that down and go first be reconciled. And after you do that, you can come back. And if you don't know where that is, that's Matthew 5, verses 23 to 24. Let's continue. Next heading. Luther cheated Christianity of its true New Testament principles. This is the quote This is in Kierkegaard's Attack, above we cited at page 32. O Luther, the Christianity of the New Testament simply does not exist. Here there is nothing to reform. What has to be done is to throw a light upon a criminal offense, a criminal offense against Christianity. He is saying somebody has committed a crime against Christ, prolonged through centuries, perpetuated by millions, more or less guiltily, whereby they have cunningly, under the guise of perfecting Christianity, sought little by little to cheat God out of Christianity, and have succeeded in making Christianity exactly the opposite of what it is in the New Testament. Kierkegaard's Attack. Can you believe that Gray says this isn't significant negative statements, his positives outweigh the negative statements? These negative statements are destructive of anything of what we're doing in Protestant Christianity today is valid. And that is a fact. Protestantism, Christianly considered, is quite simply an untruth. That means it's a lie. What we're doing in Protestant Christianity is a lie, is what he's saying. How can that be something where the positives of Paul outweigh the negatives? A piece of dishonesty which falsifies the teaching, the worldview, the life view of Christianity at 34. Next. Cover up by artifice that this mitigation of Christianity, this Paulinism, abandoned Christ. I want to have the mitigation that is current to Christianity here in this country, meaning Netherlands, set it alongside the New Testament in order to see how these two relate to each other. If I or anyone else can show it can be maintained face to face with Christianity of the New Testament, then I will accept it with the greatest joy. But one thing I do not want at any price, I do not want to create by suppression or artifice the appearance that the current Christianity in this country and the Christianity of the New Testament resemble each other. The extreme mitigation of Christianity of the New Testament cannot possibly hold good when every artifice has been used to cover up the difference between the Christianity of the New Testament and this mitigation. Kierkegaard, What Do I Want? 1855, in the Essential Kierkegaard, year 2000, F429. Next. Said before, what Gray is saying is that, yes, he says some things that sound negative, but they're overwhelmed by the positives. But he never tells you any of the positives that Kierkegaard ever said about Paul. Now, listen to this. Tell me if you can ever believe what Gray said is credibly going to be found in any writings of Paul. He has to come forward, but in 7 years, 8 years since he wrote that book, he's done nothing to correct this record. Inasmuch as I have made a critical comment upon the apostle, the following is to be noted. I am entirely within my rights, for the apostle Paul is only a man. If in the teaching of the apostle Paul there is found even the slightest degree anything that can be related to what in the course of centuries has become the sophistic, which consumes all Christianity, I must raise an outcry, lest the sophists appeal to the apostle. And I just want to stop right there. I told you the messages of Paul, where he can speak out of both sides of his mouth, is a sophist tactic. That's when you say sophistry, that's what it means. Person who can glide two contrary ideas and make them seem similar, and then he's trying to undermine one of the two and do it very subtly by sophistry. And so you're taken off guard because he seems to be affirming what Jesus would teach, and then as you keep going, he undermines the very message he just told you Jesus the very message that you and I both know matches Jesus. He then undermines that by teaching faith alone and all these perverse versions of how you get saved by just believing the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, or confessing him with your mouth. Somehow that's going to save you. Romans 10:9 and 1 Corinthians 15:1-4. Just go take a look at him. I must raise an outcry lest the sophists appeal to the apostle. It is of great importance, especially in Protestantism, to straighten out the prodigious confusion Luther has brought about by inverting the relationship and, in effect, criticizing Christ by Paul, the master by the disciple. What I have done is to hold up Christ's preaching alongside the preaching of the apostle. And this is, you'll find it in Kierkegaard, Attack, Princeton, 282, 82, 83, part of his section called My Task, September 1, 1855. Okay, so now topic number 6, challenges to restore true Christianity. And by the way, he's speaking as a Lutheran student, and he went to college to learn theology through Lutheranism. If anything is to be done, one must try to introduce Christianity into Christendom, practice of Christianity. Listen to that again. One must try to introduce Christianity into Christendom. So in other words, we've abandoned or lost Christ, and yet we profess Christ. The next quote. In Protestantism, especially in Denmark, Christianity marches to a different melody, to the tune of "Merrily we roll along, roll along, roll along." Christianity is enjoyment of life, tranquilized as neither Jew nor the pagan was by the assurance that the thing about eternity is settled precisely in order that we might find pleasure in enjoying this life, as well as any pagan or Jew. Kierkegaard, Attack, 1972, page 35. And the next quote's an important quote because Bonhoeffer obviously was influenced by it, as I'll explain. Kierkegaard writes, Protestant ministers teach that eternal blessedness can be brought for a song, that is, for cheap. A brilliant transaction. In comparison to what Jesus taught, one can readily see the minister's price is cheap, a regular selling out price. Attack at 51. So what Kierkegaard is calling it is the message of faith alone, he's calling cheap grace. This is why Bonhoeffer used the same expression, cheap grace, to indicate a faith alone doctrine. Find that in Bonhoeffer's book entitled The Cost of Discipleship, written in 1939 before he was executed during the middle of the war by the SS in the death camps. But what we also see here is the source of when Bonhoeffer says we have now developed a Christianity without Christ. If Christ were to show up in our churches today and give that message that he gave 2,000 years ago, many would not accept it because it doesn't have essentially the cheap grace gospel. That's what Bonhoeffer said in 1939. A lot of people read The Quest of Discipleship, admire everything they're reading, but they don't know what he's saying. They don't know how this impacts Paul. But let's continue. Christianity is a Christianity without Christ. Whoever thou art, whatever in other respects thy life may be, my friend, by ceasing to take part, if ordinarily you do, in the public worship of God, as now it is, with the claim that it is Christianity of the New Testament, you have constantly one guilt the less, and that a great one. Thou dost not take part in treating God as a fool by calling that the Christianity of the New Testament, which is not the Christianity of the New Testament. So he's basically saying, as long as you keep going to the churches that are basically pretending to be a Christian church by not following Christ, but following another voice of cheap grace, you're not a true Christian. You think you are, but you're not. You're being deceived. And he says you're wiser to not do that. It's one less sin, not attending such churches. Very strong words. I just want to read a commentator who doesn't agree with Gray that you can just look at positive statements about Paul versus negative statements about Paul, and you can reach a different conclusion that somehow Kierkegaard really isn't anti-Paul. Now, again, remember, Gray cites absolutely not one quote of Kierkegaard that's positive, but he says there's a plenty. I haven't found really any. However, some specialists concede that Kierkegaard turned against Paul's validity. Quote, S.K. Soren Kierkegaard's ever stricter demands also led him to turn against the Apostle Paul. So he got it. Peter Rodi. Now, I want to talk about how the message of Kierkegaard is overlooked by scholars. One has to think Kierkegaard would laugh if he could read what some scholars have said about his reverence and trust in the authority of Paul. These writers have downplayed in the extreme that Kierkegaard stood in opposition to all of Paul's main idea on faith alone and his supposed authority as an apostle, placing these points in discrete yet unmistakable places in his writings. Here is an example of a scholar who twisted entirely around to represent the opposite of Kierkegaard's point about Paul. So this is possibly what Gray was looking at, but you can't derive a conclusion about Paul by looking at other scholars unless you yourself have studied and read enough of Kierkegaard and his commentary on Paul before you adopt an opinion you're going to read here. But this is maybe what influenced Gray. Kierkegaard is rather consistent in his treatment of Paul throughout his corpus, affirming his status as an apostle. False. He said he doesn't have that validity. See, I showed that to you earlier. Emphasizing his call to action. Really? I didn't find that. Did you? The words of his were he's not an apostle, rather than a more Lutheran focus on Paul's assurance of grace, and ascribing a sense of divine authority to both Paul's life and writings. That never happens. Divine authority? Never, never, never. Find it for me. And at least let's put it this way. Once we reach 1855 and he's taking these strong stances, then you have to say, well, what's his final position after 1855? And I've shown you what his real positions is. But can you believe people can write like this and not tell you the truth? Laurie Unger Brandt, Paul, Herald of Grace and Paradigm of Christian Living. Wow. And Kierkegaard in the Bible, Great Britain, 2010. What scholarship is going on in this world where you can't see the words on the page and what they mean and thoroughly research the topic? If you're going to write a book about Kierkegaard, you better know him and not just read what you want to think you think is there. A thorough examination of Kierkegaard's writings proves these highlighted statements are impossible. Thus, Gray leaves us subject to, now let's go back to Gray. Thus, Gray leaves us subject to that one primary exception of Kierkegaard to see the anti-Paul critiques he attacks are supposedly motivated most often by hate of Paul. These haters are what Gray a couple of times describes as Paul despisers. That's at Kindle location 5478. See also 1733, 1916. So, in other words, the most common thing he describes the people who are critical of Paul is they're Paul despisers or Paul haters. And that is totally what? Ad hominem. That's trashing the people's point of view because you're claiming they have a hatred instead of they're objectively examining Paul against the words of Christ. Clearly, that's a valid reason. If Paul is an apostate against the words of Jesus, let alone the law, he cannot be a follower or an apostle of Jesus Christ. And that's what Kierkegaard actually said, contrary to what the scholar Brandt claimed. All right, so now I begin to recap what Gray's saying. Stereotyping, ad hominem attacks, Paul haters, and unchristian anti-Paulinists. So all the anti-Pauline statements have been narrowed down by excluding all the New Testament, just explaining those all away, all the reference by Jesus to the one who's called the least, and by James calling him out directly, and by Peter calling him out according to Augustine, and all these other references that are clearly in the New Testament. The apocalypse of Peter, a cunning man who leads people away from God's law. All these proofs from the New Testament or the New Testament, original New Testament, are ignored and just left in the dust. And then what do you have left? You have Hitler, Al Qaeda, and Nietzsche. That's all that he admits are anti-Paulinists in history up to this point, that have material meaning in terms of what, in the era we're leading up to, what were the anti-Pauline movements prior to today. And this is it. He doesn't tell you anything about for example, again, at Revelation 2, Jesus condemns clearly. Someone says you can eat meat sacrificed to idols. I covered that. He doesn't even go into that. Let's continue. Thus, Gray describes the anti-Paulinist as someone, quote, you know when you see it, Kindle 272, an implied toxically foul nature. Such an expression was made famous by a Supreme Court decision that said, as to illicit obscenity, quote, you know it when you see it. The implied foul nature, supposedly, of all anti-Paulinism emerges when the list is typically described by Gray as despisers of Paul. Again, classic ad hominem, illogical, fallacious argument. The names and figures Gray cites leave nothing in doubt. They range from those who either suffer from clinical insanity, Nietzsche, or anti-Semites because Paul was a Jew while giving Jesus a pass, Hitler, or were defending illicit sex from Paul's verses against it, or women liberationists who despise Paul for his supposed hatred of women in particular, Kindle 28665, or who are Muslims in Al Qaeda who support bin Laden, who think Paul is licentious, Kindle 216. So there you are. You're lumped in because he's not accepted anything from the Bible, as from the New Testament and the New Testament history, and from the Protestant Reformation, and from Kierkegaard is really anti-Paul. When you weigh it all together, all we have left is Nietzsche, Hitler, and Al Qaeda. Right? That's it. So if you want to take the position that you're against Paul, this is your company that you keep. You're keeping with Nietzsche, Hitler, and the Muslims, right? The Al Qaeda Muslims, terrorists. That's where he's left you. See what very cleverly done by manipulating all the facts and ignoring all the facts that don't go along with his thesis, and only taking all those things that would lead you to this conclusion. Let me continue. The lesson Gray leaves without much effort to bury in his academic prose is that anti-Paulinists are a strange bunch of predominantly Paul haters or anti-Christians or sin defenders. As a Christian reading Gray's work, you would want to run away as far as you can from even a Christian who criticizes Paul or his doctrines as generally taught. Am I wrong? No. It's ad hominem in the extreme. So let's continue. Again, all this makes me wish Gray would give us a clue whether anyone ever had a Bible-based reason to reject Paul's writings as works of a false prophet. Even what Kierkegaard's theological problem was with Paul is construed typically to support cheap grace without repentance, that is faith alone, is not expressly articulated by Gray. See Kindle location 2164. Gray's closest quote is where he says Kierkegaard's soft statement that with Paul, quote, man gets off a little easier in becoming a Christian. So what he seems to be suggesting is that Kierkegaard is concerned that Paul gives a Christian less of a need to repent from sin than Jesus. And he just calls it like a hint. It's a little easier, just a little easier with Paul than Jesus. And that's not what he said. There is no requirement of any works from Paul, and that's not a little easier, a little that is totally easy versus Jesus, which is totally hard, which requires repentance and so on. So we are left starving for knowledge of what Christians who are true Christians have ever thought are substantive Bible-based criticisms about Paul, especially his writings, let alone what our Savior thought about Paul. Gray's ironic confirmation bias, closing comment. Gray also has very little effort in his final chapter finding any meaning in all this hard work. I am sure he had an observation that could have been more helpful than to warn solely about, quote, confirmation bias. That is, he says that those who pit Jesus versus Paul have a confirmation bias, potential that they, quote, know what Jesus says, and that proves Paul is wrong, when the real problem, supposedly, is that we don't know what Jesus truly said. So what that's his whole argument is, well, how do you know what Jesus really said? We You got Paul over here, the problem is he knows exactly what Paul said, but he's trying to tell us we can't have a firm understanding of what Jesus said. We can only know what Paul said. No, we can know what Jesus said, and if it's contradictory and the words have meanings, and if Paul clearly contradicts Jesus, then you have to reject Paul. It's just as easy as that. It's not a hard thing. Gray at Kindle location 25244 says some unidentified anti-Paul voices rely upon Jesus to criticize Paul, who are, quote, oblivious to the effects of confirmation bias. Oh, so somebody who knows how to read English and compare one English text to another can see a contradiction. No, their reasoning for doing the finding a contradiction isn't linguistics and isn't measuring logic. No, it's confirmation bias. They want to come to a conclusion against Paul. No, that's not true. I love Paul. I love Paul. I don't have any reason to hate Paul. I don't agree with him. I think he lies. He deliberately defends lying, and that's a real problem. And we've shown that in this series. A bias that, quote, that the existing body of knowledge about Jesus is sufficiently complete as to permit authoritative and incontrovertible repudiation of Pauline teaching. So let me just say this. He's literally saying the only way to beat Paul, it has to be incontrovertible. Now, actually, it's all incontrovertible. Everything I've told you above is fact, and he doesn't know any of it. And that's why he can't discuss it with you, because he can't controvert it. So the real fact of the problem for him is he's reaching a broad conclusion, a broad brush, and he didn't even stand up to the challenge like a man and actually deal with the facts and statements that have been in my book since 2005, many other people, by the way, and documented clearly on my website long before he wrote his book. Let's continue. Please note in this quote of Gray how Paul gets a pass based on probability unless a proof from Jesus is an incontrovertible repudiation of Paul. Even in that case, Gray still believes such proof is hardly enough to disprove Paul's validity, because supposedly we cannot be ironclad sure what Jesus means. Can you believe this stuff? Unless you absolutely have a certain proof, Paul has to remain. No, he doesn't. If Jesus says one thing and Paul says likely the opposite, then what is our obligation? To read the words that are clear in Jesus and ignore the unclear words in Paul? How about that? That would be a smart thing to do. Thus, this final point about confirmation bias by Gray as framed has no value. The term confirmation bias is not an identification of a fallacy, but it means you must just trust the thoroughness of work if you can see signs that the author sought only evidence to support the view he or she preferred. The author ignored contrary evidence. Guess who that really applies to? That applies to Gray. Did he look at any contrary evidence to anything that he was saying? No. Who did that for you? I did it. Why didn't he do it? Because this man has confirmation bias up the yazoo, clearly proven by everything I just showed you. Gray does not identify anyone guilty of confirmation bias in the anti-Paul camp. Thus, we have no evidence provided for the main conclusion Gray offered. There it is. He had no proof that anybody on the anti-Paul side were guilty of confirmation bias, that they were skewing things to see only negative in Paul. That's not necessary. Paul does it all by himself. Like as I said, he blows himself up with his words. All right. God bless everybody. I hope that helped. Ciao. Bye.